The story was told to me by someone who swore it was true, though I can't say for sure. It was about a guy named Robert Norris. He was a gardener from Boulder, Colorado, with a knack for building custom computers in his spare time. Not the type you'd expect to hear hunting stories from, but he had a group of old friends who dragged him along on these trips every spring. This time, they had decided on the mountains of Wyoming. The air was crisp and smelled of pine, and the snow melt had turned the rivers into roaring channels that cut through the wilderness. The days were warm enough to make you comfortable in a light jacket, but the nights were another story. Cold, silent, and vast. The group had set up camp near a grove of aspens, with their white trunks standing in sharp contrast to the darker evergreens surrounding them. They spent the first day hunting, trekking through uneven terrain and tracking deer that seemed unusually scarce for that time of year. Robert wasn't much of a hunter, but he enjoyed the camaraderie, the joking, the stories, the shared meals over a crackling campfire. That night, they sat around the fire, passing a bottle of whiskey and swapping tales. It was then that one of his friends brought up an old local legend. "You ever hear about the Wendigo?" the guy asked, his voice low and conspiratorial. Robert had heard the term before, but only in passing. It was something about a spirit or creature that thrived on human flesh, born of greed or starvation. His friend explained how the legend had roots in Native American folklore, a cautionary tale about what happens when desperation consumes a man. "People say these woods are its territory," the friend continued. "You hear those weird howls at night? Might not just be coyotes." Everyone laughed it off, but the firelight cast long shadows, and for a moment, the night felt heavier. The second day was uneventful, though the tension among the group seemed to grow. They'd split up into pairs to cover more ground, but Robert couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The woods were too quiet, and the tracks they found were often old or led nowhere. That evening, as they regrouped at the campsite, one of the guys didn't show up. His name was Tyler, and he was known for wandering off on his own, so at first, they weren't too worried. They spread out to search for him, calling his name into the growing twilight. It was Robert who found the first sign of trouble, a broken arrow lying in the dirt, its shaft splintered as if it had been snapped in two. Nearby, the ground was churned up, as though something heavy had been dragged through the underbrush. "Guys, over here!" he yelled, his voice breaking the unnatural stillness. The others arrived, their faces pale in the fading light. They followed the trail, which led deeper into the woods, the trees pressing in on all sides. The air grew colder, and the sound of their boots crunching on twigs seemed deafening. Then they heard it. A low, guttural growl that froze them in their tracks. The creature stepped into view just at the edge of their flashlights. It was tall, impossibly thin, with pale, almost translucent skin stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers smoldering in a dying fire. For a moment, no one moved. Then the thing let out a scream, a high-pitched wail that sent shivers down Robert's spine. It lunged at them, its movements jerky and unnatural. Robert and his friends scattered, the creature chasing after them with an eerie silence, save for the crunch of leaves underfoot. In the chaos, one of the guys tripped and fell, and the creature was on him in an instant. Robert didn't look back. He and the others regrouped near the campsite, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. "We have to get out of here," someone said, his voice trembling. They grabbed what they could, rifles, flashlights, knives, and left everything else behind. The creature was still out there, its wails echoing through the woods as they made their way toward the nearest road. The night seemed endless, the forest a maze that refused to let them go. They finally reached the dirt road just as dawn began to break, the faint light giving them a sliver of hope. By the time they reached the nearest town, they were half frozen and covered in scratches. Tyler was gone. Tyler was gone, and no one wanted to talk about what had happened. Robert later learned that the area was known for strange disappearances, though no one ever blamed the Wendigo outright. Whatever they had encountered, it wasn't something they wanted to name. He hasn't gone hunting since. The story came to me from someone it happened to a guy they knew, a man named Chuck Cavell. He was a delivery driver from Austin, Texas, with a passion for hiking and exploring the rugged trails that snaked through the hill country. Chuck was the type of guy who could talk for hours about the best boots for rocky terrain or the virtues of a sturdy backpack. He also had a dog named Bruno, a big, friendly mutt who was as much a part of Chuck's adventures as his hiking poles. It was supposed to be a getaway, a chance for Chuck and a few friends to relax at a cabin in northern Michigan. The summer had brought lush greenery to the forests, and the air smelled of damp earth and blooming wildflowers. The cabin was tucked deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, with a wide porch and a fire pit out front. The first day passed uneventfully. The group spent their time fishing in the nearby lake and swapping stories around the fire as dusk settled in. Chuck mentioned a game he'd played once, something about skinwalkers, and the conversation turned to folklore. One of his friends joked about the strange noises they might hear in the woods, but no one took it seriously. It was the second night when things started to feel off. Bruno was the first to notice. The dog's ears perked up and he let out a low growl, staring into the trees beyond the firelight. Chuck dismissed it as a deer or maybe a raccoon, but Bruno wouldn't settle. He kept pacing and whining, his eyes fixed on the darkness. Later, as the group sat around the fire, they heard it, a faint rustling in the bushes. It could have been the wind, but there wasn't enough of a breeze to stir the leaves. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. Chuck grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the woods, but the beam only revealed shadows and the occasional glint of animal eyes. His friends laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unease, but Bruno's behavior kept everyone on edge. That night, Chuck woke to the sound of scratching at the cabin door. It wasn't frantic, like an animal trying to get in, but slow and deliberate, almost like someone testing the wood. He grabbed a hunting knife from his bag and crept to the door, Bruno at his heels. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady despite the chill creeping up his spine. No answer. The scratching stopped, replaced by silence so deep it pressed against his ears. Then came a knock. 3 sharp raps, as if from a knuckle. Chuck's heart raced. He glanced at Bruno, whose hackles were raised, his lips curled back in a silent snarl. Slowly, Chuck opened the door a crack, the knife ready in his hand. Nothing. The porch was empty, the forest beyond still and silent. But just as he was about to close the door, he caught a whiff of something foul. Rotting meat mixed with damp soil. He barely slept the rest of the night. The next day, they found tracks in the mud around the cabin. They weren't animal prints, at least not any animal they could identify. The shapes were long and narrow, almost human, but with claws at the tips of the toes. By evening, the group was on edge. They built the fire higher and kept their weapons close, a couple of hunting rifles and a hatchet one of the guys had brought for chopping wood. Bruno stayed close to Chuck, his usually wagging tail tucked firmly between his legs. When the creature finally revealed itself, it was in the dead of night. It started with a scream, a high, piercing wail that echoed through the trees and made their skin crawl. Then came the sound of something large crashing through the underbrush. The thing stepped into the firelight, just enough for them to catch a glimpse. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long and its skin pale as bone. Its eyes glowed faintly in the firelight, and its mouth was a twisted grin, showing rows of jagged teeth. Chuck and his friends opened fire, the cracks of the rifles shattering the night. The creature let out a howl and disappeared into the darkness, but the damage was done. One of the guys lay on the ground, his throat torn open, blood pooling around him. "Run!" Chuck yelled, grabbing Bruno's leash. They didn't stop to pack. They left the fire burning and ran through the woods, the creature's guttural growls following close behind. Branches tore at their clothes, and the uneven ground threatened to trip them with every step. Somehow, they made it to the main road, where the headlights of an approaching car were the most beautiful sight Chuck had ever seen. They flagged the driver down, piled into the car, and didn't look back. They called the police from the nearest town, but when authorities arrived at the cabin, there was no sign of the creature. The only evidence left behind was the blood-stained ground where their friend had fallen and the strange tracks leading into the woods. Locals later told them about the legends, how the area was said to be haunted by skinwalkers, shapeshifters that could mimic human voices and take on other forms. Chuck didn't want to know more. He hasn't been back to Michigan since. They say the Blue Mountains have a soul of their own, a kind of restless spirit that watches anyone who dares to tread too far into its hidden corners. That's what I was told when I heard the story about Keanu Bean, a park ranger from Texas who spent his off hours tinkering with custom computer builds. He wasn't the type you'd imagine in the middle of nowhere, more at home under the glow of LEDs than the pale light of the moon, but he loved the quiet challenge of winter hiking. Keanu had moved to the area a few years back, trading Texas's dry plains for the Blue Mountains' jagged ridges and dense forests. The winter here wasn't kind. The wind bit through even the thickest layers, and snow clung stubbornly to the trails. Keanu, though, found peace in the desolation. The day started like any other. Keanu set out mid-morning, his pack filled with essentials, a knife, a flashlight, and a first aid kit. The wind was fierce, howling through the trees like an invisible predator. The clouds hung low, heavy with the promise of more snow. Keanu planned to reach a small clearing about 10 miles in, a spot he'd visited before and knew well. The first sign that something was wrong came as he neared the clearing. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustle of branches, the chirping of birds, had gone silent. It was an oppressive quiet, the kind that presses against your ears and makes your heartbeat sound too loud. Keanu brushed it off at first, chalking it up to the wind. But then he found the tracks. They were unlike anything he'd seen before, large and deep with claw marks that gouged into the frozen ground. They didn't look like bear prints or anything else he'd encountered in his years as a ranger. Keanu crouched down, examining them closely. The stride was long, and whatever had made them had been heavy, its weight sinking into the snow. He shook off the unease creeping up his spine and continued to the clearing, telling himself it was just a big dog or maybe even a wolf. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. By the time he reached the clearing, the wind had picked up, whipping snow into his face and making it hard to see. He set up a small fire, more for comfort than warmth, and sat down to eat. The flames flickered wildly in the wind, casting long shadows across the snow. That's when he saw it, or thought he did. A shape, low to the ground, moving just at the edge of the firelight. Keanu froze, his hand going to the knife at his side. The shape didn't come closer, but it didn't leave either. It circled, staying just out of sight. The occasional crunch of snow, the only indication it was still there. Keanu's mind raced. He'd read stories about creatures in these mountains, tales whispered by locals and buried in obscure forums online. They called it the Dogman, a hulking canine-like figure that walked on two legs and was said to stalk the woods. He dismissed it as nonsense, a mix of folklore and overactive imaginations. But now, sitting alone in the clearing with something prowling just beyond the firelight, he wasn't so sure. The first real attack came just after midnight. Keanu had dozed off, lulled by the warmth of the fire, when he was jolted awake by Bruno's snarl. He looked up just in time to see a flash of movement, a blur of gray and black, before something slammed into him, knocking him backward into the snow. The creature was massive, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Its breath was hot and rancid, and its claws dug into his shoulders as it pinned him down. Keanu lashed out with his knife, the blade sinking into its side. The creature howled, a bone-chilling sound that echoed through the mountains and retreated into the darkness. Keanu didn't wait to see if it would come back. He grabbed his pack, doused the fire with snow, and started moving. His shoulder throbbed where the creature had clawed him, but adrenaline pushed him forward. He spent the night navigating the forest, sticking to the shadows and avoiding open spaces. The wind howled louder than ever, masking the sounds of his movements but also making it harder to hear if the creature was following. By dawn, he was exhausted, his body aching from the cold and the strain of staying alert. He finally reached the edge of the forest where a narrow dirt road cut through the trees. A truck appeared in the distance, its headlights piercing the morning gloom. Keanu stumbled into the road, waving his arms to flag it down. The driver, a local hunter, helped him into the cab and drove him to the nearest town. Keanu told the man what had happened, and though the hunter didn't say much, his tight-lipped expression spoke volumes. Locals later filled in the gaps. The Blue Mountains had long been home to stories of the Dogman, a creature as old as the woods themselves. Sightings were rare, but those who'd encountered it spoke of its cunning, its relentless stalking, and its almost supernatural ability to vanish without a trace. Keanu didn't care about the stories anymore. He cared about the scars on his shoulder and the nightmares that followed him long after he left the mountains. And he never went hiking alone again.